Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Opening Bell. This is a bonus podcast, and I have one of my favourite people actually that I've ever met in boxing alongside me. So it's a great honour to welcome Jack Hirsch, the esteemed writer, former amateur boxer, and you are here to talk about your book, your authorised biography with one of the greatest fighters of all time, and that's Michael Spinks. Top three light heavyweight for me. Did some fantastic things at heavyweight. Perhaps unfairly defined by his last fight, which everybody will know was the 91-second loss to Mike Tyson. But we will talk about that in a bit more detail later on. I want the opening bell crew to get to know the one and only Jack Hirsch. So let's take you back to the beginning, rather the beginning of your boxing journey. So tell us how you started in this incredibly murky, fantastic, weird world of boxing.
Well, I appreciate the kind words, Matt. This November, I'm actually going to be inducted into the New Jersey State Boxing Hall of Fame. And someone made a comment on social media, well, who are these people? I don't know who they are. And I'm thinking, you idiot, I've been around all this time. You haven't even heard of my name? Come on. But I never answer on social media because it's a fight you can't win when you go back and forth. So I kind of ignore things like that. And wow, how I got my start. I mean, that's isn't that the most common question? And I know you've been asked that a lot. I mean, how did you get your start in boxing? How did you become interested in it? And the answer is, who knows? It just kind of grips you, like from a very young age. You take an interest in a certain event, a certain fighter. And when I was, very young, it was Muhammad Ali in his heyday, at his peak, and there's no one better to create interest than him. And and of course I took an interest. I was an amateur boxer. I hated the boxing part of it, Matt, quite honestly. I loved being around the gym. I loved working out. I hated the part of being a fighter, and I've told this story numerous times. I started shortly before Vito Antifermo did. And I was there with the coach the day Vito was first brought into the gym. And there he is standing next to me being introduced. And I'm just like eyeing him. And if you froze that moment and considered what would have become, him world middleweight champion, could you imagine when he's brought into the gym? Because now there's going to be a future world middleweight champion. And then they point to me and they say, you're going to be president of the Boxing Writers Association of America. And then they would point to the police officer who brought him in was Joe Dwyer, who was a well-known judge, the late Joe Dwyer, president of the NABF. And the coach, actually, Joe LaGuardia, was a stablemate of the great Tony Canzoneri. He was a fair professional fighter himself. So some scenes are like crazy. I mean, like if you could just go back in time and freeze it, it's kind of like unbelievable. But so I sparred with Vito for a couple of years, and Vito was going at half speed, to be honest. To him, it was just getting the work in, and I was going all out just to survive. And Vito loves the one line. He reminds me to always say it. What our coach used to tell us, he'd call us in the middle of the ring for instructions. He'd say, Jack, jab and run, Vito, go easy. The instructions always very plain, and Vito loves that story. He always wants me to tell it to people when we're together.
What an experience, though. So, what then took you from sparring a future world middleweight champion to into the world of boxing journalism?
Yeah, I'd go to these fights as a teenager, and I go myself because boxing's unique. It's not like other sports. Like in your country, when you were young, you could probably get your friends to go to a soccer match. You call it
Yeah,
football there pretty easily. But if you were going to a boxing show, it's harder to get people to go with you there because they're kind of less fans than some of the other major sports. Not that boxing's any less of a great sport than the others. And I go myself, I'd write about it beforehand, what I anticipated. I'd get home, I'd write all about the fights. And this was kind of odd. At the age of 16, I wrote a letter to Boxing Illustrated. There was this columnist named Lee Kerr, and he had these guest columns. And I remember writing, I'm only 16, but I'm going to become a boxing writer because I kind of feel it's my duty because the guys writing today, really don't know the sport that well in that sense. So it's kind of odd, having that column from age 16 and actually doing it. But I caught on with a number, magazines I write for. And then, of course, the one that's closest to your heart, the one that you became, famous editor of Boxing News. I got in touch with the great Harry Mullen in 1989 and asked to come on board. And he had me write a column for him just to check out. And then he said that's exactly what he wanted. And it was like Jack Hirsch on the New York beat, one of those. And then it kind of, and then it's all this time I've kind of, been with Boxing News, but to a limited basis in a large degree. It's now a monthly and so on, but it's a relationship that I'm really, very proud of because of how long it's lasted.
Well, you'll always be the senior US correspondent in my eyes for Boxing News, Jack. I mean,
Yeah, well, I
you were
still got that
fantastic.
title. I'm like a legacy, like an antique kind of. They put me out there. It's funny the way things change. The advantage to getting older. When I was young, I'd be in the press room of Madison Square Garden, and I'd be giving my views on things, and all the other writers would just be walking by, and I'd just be talking to the one person I'm with. And then one time I'm giving my views and I'm looking, there's this whole crowd around me of young writers. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not saying anything that's more logical or more knowledgeable than I did decades ago, but they want to get all this part in history. And I guess these are invaluable things like, attending in person the first, the only fight, of course, between Buchanan and Duran, the first Ali Frazier fight, and a bunch of other fights when Duran lost his first fight to Stebbin, the Jesus St. George Foreman fight, Chuck Wepner. I mean, I guess as the years go by, that's like a big, big thing for people to hear the tales of those fights.
It absolutely is. And, I do think that logic is a bit of an increasing rarity in boxing media rooms these days. But yeah, something like with everything that you've experienced, yes, you demand respect. We've heard, I remember playing a clip on the opening bell before about your experiences of being at the first Ali Frazier fight. I mean, that just fascinates me, the fact that I'm now talking to someone. And as I say, it's a great honor. It's always a great honor to talk to you and spend time with you. So we've heard that one. What was it like? What about Ken Buchanan, Roberto Duran? Did that feel like you were in the presence of an oncoming
Electric,
great?
electric. What strikes me the most about that night, on June 26, 1972, was when Duran entered the ring. There was just certain electricity in the crowd. And, and the performance that both guys put on. And Ken Buchanan's performance has been largely forgotten and underrated because very few lightweights could have survived that ferocious Duran attack. And I sometimes think of Floyd Mayweather, a guy who I have tremendous respect for, who I think is a great fighter, who I think a lot of people tend to undervalue how great Mayweather was. He wasn't going to survive that Duran attack in the sense where he would be able to come back and win. Duran was unstoppable for 6, 7 rounds, absolutely unstoppable. And no other lightweight going against Duran could have won 3 of those first 7 rounds, hypothetically, even 2 of them. But Buchanan was in incredible condition, had an incredible chin, incredible heart. And he actually was trying to get back in the fight in the middle to later rounds. And of course, he got hit with the low blow that the referee, Johnny Lobianco, thought was a legitimate punch. We later saw it was a low blow. But in all fairness, with Duran in that fight, I believe Buchanan could have continued and kind of was hoping to get a disqualification on that at that point. And I know people have criticized me for that view because looking at the ring, I did see one of Buchanan's handlers put his hand down like this, like stay down, that maybe we could get a disqualification. But Buchanan wanted to continue when the fight finally got stopped. because if that was his only two options, the fight gets stopped or continue. He even indicated he wanted to continue afterwards rather than to be called a stoppage. So the attitude was if he couldn't get a disqualification, then the other way. And then we heard a report of one of the physicians saying, well, his testicles had this and that on it. I can't imagine Buchanan dropping his drawers and the doctor so carefully checking his testicles. I'm sorry. I mean, it sounds good, but if you want to question things, look at it that way.
It is now one of the most famous flagrant low blows in boxing
It
history.
was.
But
It was.
at the time of it being unleashed, and at the time of it connected with Buchanan's aforementioned testicles, was it obvious to observers at the time that something like that had occurred?
I thought in real time that Duran had kneed him. It looked low, like something happened low. It was out of the normal. It was really out of the normal. And the referee should have consulted, at ringside with the judges, the commissioner. Did you see a low blow, this or that? And in reality, he should have just maybe given. It happened at the end of the round, so he should have given Buchanan the extra time or urged him to come on or call the doctor into the ring. But the referee, Johnny Lopianco, had felt that Ken Buchanan had taken enough of a beating that he didn't want to go on, But that wasn't the case, at that point. Buchanan never stopped trying to win the fight, but he wasn't a puncher at the end of the fight. But they were trading punches at the end of the 13th round, which showed you the type of fighter that Buchanan was. And even Duran, you ask him to this day, the toughest fights he ever had, the best fighters he ever fought, he always brings up Buchanan's name now. I mean, he always indicated how good Buchanan was.
And how true are certain reports that suggest that Duran was avoiding the rematch with Ken?
I think Duran would have done what was told. Why it didn't take place, keep this in mind, the same year, 5 months later, and I was at that fight, less than 5 months later, Duran fights Esteban de Jesus in a non-title fight at Madison Square Garden, and the atmosphere for that fight wasn't anywhere near the atmosphere of the Buchanan fight. There were a fair number of empty seats in the Madison Square Garden when Duran fought de Jesus. De Jesus was a respected fighter, but we didn't know how good he really was. But he knocks Duran down in the first round, and he basically dictated the tempo in the 10-round non-title fight. And I remember scoring it for De Jesus 6-4. At that time, fights in New York were scored on a rounds basis. So De Jesus wasn't going to get the extra point, but it wasn't a disputed decision, Duran and De Jesus. I mean, no one really thought Duran won. And after that fight, well, what did I mean? Buchanan did come back and fight in New York, and he beat a fighter from South Korea. And it was one of my favorite headlines in the magazine. There were two fighters from Seoul, South Korea, and it said Buchanan and Seeley, Walter Seeley, they got a lot of soul. I was correct. I still love that headline. It was a classic. Did he duck the rematch? Let's put it this way. If they had to rematch, Duran would have won. I could see it being going to a 15-round decision. Duran would have won a clear decision, a rematch, because I think Buchanan was at his peak at that time and a little while later. And by the way, to show you the type of fighters they were back then, and I'm not putting down the guys today, believe me, I'm a big booster of the guys today as well. He loses to Duran in the fashion he did, which had to be demoralizing, and it was a physical fight. Less than 3 months later, he's fighting in Madison Square Garden in the co-feature to the Ali Floyd Patterson match, and he's fighting Carlos Ortiz, who was on the comeback trail, and it was a very timid fight, okay? And Ortiz quit on a stool at the end of 6 rounds because he was a tired old man, and he admitted, I didn't want to get hurt. I didn't want to get knocked out. And that's the thing that bothers me about boxing, Matt. You could take a legendary fighter like Carlos Ortiz, a New Yorker, lived in the Bronx, New York. his whole career and lived there till the day he died. They boo him out of the ring. So he wants to retire on a stool. Let him retire on a stool. He said, I'm never going to fight again. And they boo him. I mean, it's heartbreaking to see the way people forget. And I witnessed that at the Boxing Writers Association of America's dinner during the time I was president. I had Vitaly Klitschko come. The Klitschko brothers were both getting, I think it was the Good Guy Awards. So I had them both at my table, Vitaly Klitschko and Carlos Ortiz. When there was an intermission, the fans swarmed the table of people to try to get photos, autographs with Vitaly Klitschko. And Carlos Ortiz is just sitting there completely ignored, completely. And I could tell the hurt on the face of him and his wife. And I felt like saying, people, no disrespect to Vitaly, but Carlos was actually a better fighter pound for pound, you know? I felt like saying that, and Vitaly probably would have been enough of a gentleman had he realized what was happening. He would have tried to switch things to Carlos's favor a little bit if he could have.
You have got some fantastic stories from your time as the head of the Boxing Writers Association of America. I also, from speaking to you over the years, from reading and listening to those stories, I think it was kind of almost as stressful as it was honourable and pleasurable. Talk us through that time as the president of the BWAAs.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of fun times. I mean, I stepped down after 6 years because there was some inner things that went on, and there was a question. I could have stayed on. I could have done a Jose Suleiman, been president for life. Ironically, I'm very close in the BWAA with the current president, Joe Santoliquido. He runs things by me, and it's his final call on any decisions that have to be made, but we brainstorm, and there's been a number of things he hasn't done upon my recommendation, and some things he's specifically done that he didn't want to do. So kudos to Joe for being so open-minded and being such a good friend, as well. But I felt I had to step down because something went on, and I felt for my own self-respect. You've been there, Matt. You've been there. Maybe I'm not going to get into your thing. That's for you if you ever wanted to. But you know the feeling exactly, like where I'm coming from with that. But I was involved with the BWAA for a lot of years before that, and I continued to be involved in that sense. But one of the funny stories I got to tell you, when we had the Boxing Writers Dinner at the MGM in Las Vegas 2 days before Floyd Mayweather was going to be fighting Marcus Maidana in their first fight, Mike Tyson attended, okay? And he was sitting next to me, and Mike Tyson, through Steve Lott, I got him to present the Fight of the Year award to Timothy Bradley and Russell Provodnikov. And I remember before Tyson has to go on, he has some notes under the table, and he's shaking. And I say to Mike, don't worry about anything. Just get up there and say, boo, and people start clapping. You're Mike Tyson. No one cares what you say. Don't worry about it. And he said he's scared he can't pronounce the name Provodnikov. Right. And he said it once to me, and then he got up there and he couldn't pronounce it, and he said, and the other guy, Timothy Bradley and the other guy, or whatever Mike Tyson said. So that was kind of cool. But to show you the boxing, how erratic it is, and this still bothers me a little, 2 nights after presenting Floyd Mayweather the Fight of the Year awards, and it was the Academy Awards of Boxing at the Boxing Writers Dinner at the MGM. Yours truly comes to pick up his press credentials for the fight, and he's given one next to last row obstructed view. And because obstructed, so I'm watching it in the press room, and my wife, who didn't want to go to the fight, we had met another couple. I'm not going to say the name, but I get a phone call the day of the fight that if she'd like to go, blah, 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 has a great ringside seat. And I tell her, you can't turn down a ringside seat, bitch, show at the MGM. She would be going with another woman there we met to hang out. So my wife gets to watch the fight from ringside, and I'm watching it in the fresh room. And the reason that happened because I, I, there was jealousy on the part of someone who wasn't an award winner, as I found out. But Sam Watson, Al Heyman's right hand man, sees me at the end of the night and he asked, how did you enjoy the fight? I said, I would have enjoyed it more if I could have watched it in the arena. And I told him what happened, and he was furious. And I did get a call back a few days later saying, Al Heyman says this will never happen again. They had no idea what happened to Al Heyman, and so on. It was the person in charge of giving the credentials because they were informed during the show what was going on with me. So it wasn't an oversight, and it carried on a little while into the Barclays Center, where I would be given seats all the way in the back of the press row, all the way in the back. But I always knew how to play the game, Matt. Also, one time I go to the Barclays Center and I'm prepared. So I'm walking like I'm a stumbling old man. I'm doing it on purpose, and I intentionally make it like I'm going to fall on the back row of a tape like that. And I played the sympathy card, and one of them comes over and they said, we're not going to jerk you around anymore. We're sorry. You know what I mean? And that was the end of it. It lasted a couple of years. You know the feeling with that too. I mean, there's the editor boxing news. You got put a couple of times all the way in the back. It's like insulting.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you're obviously very honoured to be inside the arena. You're not paying for your seat. You're there at a highly anticipated fight, but you're also ultimately there to do the job that's putting food on your table. And if you
Yeah,
are if you're miles away, you might just as well be at home watching it on the television.
exactly,
I think
exactly.
the worst one was the first Golovkin Canelo fight, where I was right up in the nosebleed seats, and it looked like it was two ants fighting over a postage stamp. Um, but yeah, but then there's been countless other times where I've had wondrous seats, wondrous experiences, and yeah, it's all been fantastic. Let me talk to you a little bit more about the BWAA, and I know there's certain politics and certain things that you won't get into, but in terms of the kind of prestige and reputation of that organisation compared to many years ago, has there been an obvious change? And I suppose I'm being quite presumptuous here, purely because I know that there are not nearly as many kind of, writing in general, print journalism in general is on
Well,
its backside.
I could reveal a little more why I stepped down because we had a legitimate journalist, legitimate, who wasn't given membership in the organization, and I promised him he was going to get membership. I'm saying this for the first time publicly. I'm going to say it. A lot of years have went by, and I've mended fences with whoever. I hardly hold a grudge anymore.
Yeah.
Just maybe 10%, but the other guys I'm good with, who I had beefs with. Uh, and I promised him he would have membership. I could have overruled our membership committee. Our membership committee, I'm not going to give the names, but they were very prestigious guys, the biggest names
Yeah.
amongst the boxing writers. But I could have overruled them because, according to the bylaws, the membership committee works at the leisure of the president. But if I overrule the membership committee, it would be it wouldn't be the right thing morally to do. It would be like a dictatorship, a legal
Uh-huh.
dictatorship. And after I gave my promise that I couldn't keep, you know, I felt I had to move on for my own self respect. I felt I didn't keep my promise, to this rider. I couldn't make him a member. Okay. I could have made him a member, but I would have had to overrule the membership committee. So those were my two alternatives. And I decided, if these guys don't value me enough at this point, and they didn't think I was going to step down, it was kind of like a bluff. I think they were completely shocked it happened, but I felt I just didn't want to continue, with that circumstance. So,
Do you,
yeah,
that must have been exceptionally difficult.
it was very difficult, very
I know how
difficult.
proud
I
you
was
are.
hoping not, I was hoping in a way no one would take the job, uh, in the sense that I'd have an excuse to continue. That's how conflicted I was. But then when Joe Santoliquito took the job, I'm getting all these calls about the dinner that I got to run it the first year, run it, put on it, do the whole thing. And Joe's calling me the whole time. And ironically, Joe'd run against me as president the first time around with an election I won. And he gave me a wonderful compliment, years later out of nowhere. He says, I'm sure glad I lost to you that election the first time. I wouldn't have been able to do this, on my own if you went there. But Joe's been a really good president, really good guy. But now you get Turkey, His Excellency. I can never say his last name, pronounce it. They put on their own banquet. But when you look at the amount of money they spend, but let me tell you what bothers me about the BWA banquets, and I play a prominent role in helping put it on. Okay, myself, Joe Santoliquito, the president, and our great event coordinator Gina Andriolo uh, work closely together in putting it on, and we have a number of people contribute. Writing stories for the journal, this and that, stuffing the gift bags, but the lack of people that want to contribute to making it a success. I mean, I would call people up who are wealthy, there was one fighter, I'm not going to mention his name. He goes out to a strip club, he'll drop 25, $50,000 at the snap of a finger, and you want him to put out $1,500 to take out an ad, and they won't do it. Then they're becoming businessmen, and they act like they're doing you a favor. Oh, well, we're doing this for your banquet, and we're like volunteers. We're volunteers putting all this work, and we're doing it for the sport. And the people who can afford to help out a little, I mean, they don't. You've written a little about that, I think, in your Ringside Charities. So what's the name of that very good
Ringside
group?
Charitable Trust.
Right, and the people who are in a great position to help, very few of them help. Very few. And they'll spend money on a whim and other things, but something that's such a noble cause, how many of them really step up the way they can?
Not enough, Jack. That's for sure. Not enough. And do you believe that? Do you believe the boxing journalism or even certain boxing writers carry the same gravitas that they did back in the day?
No, no, it's unfortunate. No, I mean, I recognized this about 6 years ago. Like it hit me like a ton of bricks when I was in Miami when Jake Paul was starting out. Against who? Gibbs. Oh, I don't have the whole name. What is a YouTube guy on the big show? And I go to the press conference beforehand, and I walk in and I see all the media opposite me, and I'm looking at them. They're looking at me. I can't recognize one person. And now, even in New York, I went to the press conference a couple of weeks ago, Boots Innes, Xander Zayas,
Mm.
and I'm looking around. I mean, there are no real writers there. It's a bunch of fanboys, they have a microphone, they put something on YouTube. But listen, Matt, we're living in a new world. That's just the way it is. You could get more people to watch something by putting it on YouTube than by the printed word. It's just the way it is. And and the mindset of fans has changed. And I take in all the little scenes, like 4 or 5 years ago when I'm in Las Vegas and watch Sean Porter fighting Terrence Crawford. I actually covered the fight from the stands rather than the press row. A buddy of mine bought me a ticket so he could sit with me. So I'm sitting in the crowd taking my notes, reporting on it that way. I think I sent you the report that way, but I was ringside anyway you look at it. But when I'm leaving the arena, I'm just looking at the people, and it's like date night. That's the crowd. It's nice that it's a young person's sport, but you don't have real fight fans like who have a passion for it, like I was when I was a kid. And like I go to the Hall of Fame every year when I go to the Hall of Fame weekends. I'd always have dinner with Jack Obermeyer, Jeff Jowett, Neil Terrence. We were real fans from the time we were a kid. Russell Peltz, a real fight fan. they're just not guys like us around anymore. You could hardly find them. And I know we talk about, well, all this competition from other sports, but look, baseball was around then, football was around, basketball was around. It's not like it was just invented, but boxing has just hurt itself with all, not all the belts and all the good fights that aren't being made. I mean, there's no substitute for good fights, as I've read that you've pointed out. I mean, nothing like a great boxing match, the anticipation, nothing compares to it. But there's so few of that going around.
Well, I agree with that. I know we've had a kind of a spate of kind of undisputed title fights in recent years that people will point to and what have you, but I've never really been of the belief that the boxers are necessarily less talented now, but we are not getting anything like the volume of high quality fights that we used to get. There's too many avenues where those high quality fighters can't fight each other. They can go and do their own thing and build their own name. But I mean, you know my opinion on that. Yours is
Well,
the
well,
same as
that's why
mine.
I'm happy. I have a podcast too, and I had a fighter on Bryce Mills, who is managed by Russell Peltz. He's a big shot in upstate New York. He immediately, and he's a real talented fighter as well, real talented at junior welterweight. He's been calling out Emiliano Vargas, from who's promoted by Top Rank. Vargas is a hot prospect. He's 17-0. Mills is something like 25-1 maybe, or thereabouts. And they're going to be meeting on the undercard, and that's
Yeah,
what you like to see. Once in a while, you get an aberration, like you had in England, like when you had Joe Joyce fight Daniel Dubois, two unbeaten heavyweights
yeah.
at the time. I mean, that's unusual, but that used to happen all the time. And now it's just protecting a guy, building him up, and it's more avoidance than anything else. And these pay-per-view prices too. There's a couple of pretty good fights. Obviously, Saturday, in a way in Nakatani, and and then in the evening you have, at least United States time, you have David Benavidez against Zerto Ramirez. Now Zerto Ramirez and Benavidez is an $80 pay-per-view fight. I mean, show. It's just not worth it. It's a very good fight, very good, very solid. And I'm thinking, maybe I'm going to get the fight. Maybe I'm going to give in and subscribe to the Zone, their ultimate package. I've been catching the fights the next day on YouTube because I think it's a ripoff. And then I think to myself, well, wait a second. If the New York Knicks of the NBA lose game 6 to the Atlanta Hawks, they're going to be playing game 7 Saturday night, a deciding game. Why do I have to buy the fight? I'm an NBA fan too. To the heck with the fight. I'll see it on YouTube the next morning. So, I
Well,
mean, yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more. And kind of before we do move on, I think everything you've identified there is an issue within boxing, and I think those that kind of work within boxing and profit from boxing don't
Yeah.
always like to admit it, don't always like to address those things. But I think you can take it back to a particular time, actually, about a fighter we'll talk about in a minute, around the time of Michael Spinks, when all of a sudden you got the IBF coming along, you got the WBO coming along, and it's so easy then to make all of these different world title fights. But as a consequence of that, it becomes increasingly difficult for the public to then know who the best is in each division. And then within that time as well, we've got all of these paywalls slamming down in front of us. And I think you've almost made a mainstream sport into a niche sport with those two factors, the paywalls and the multiple titles. I think if you'd have taken those away, I think the sport would be flourishing. And we know it still can flourish. We know when there's a big fight everybody wants to watch. There's no feeling like it in the world. But we are where we are, aren't we, Jack? We are where we are. You can only
We
say
are
so
where
much
we
of this
are,
stuff.
but you'll get Fury and Joshua probably later this year, unless Christian Pranger, can upset Joshua. And I'm going to have Pranger on my podcast called Glove Fist Monday
Are
night.
you really?
He's coming on as a guest, but I watched tapes of him fighting, and his way to beat Joshua, wow. I mean, they're going to have to sit down and devise some strategy. And I don't want to hear the basic strategy. Well, if you can catch someone, When you say a guy has a puncher's chance, Matt, that means he has no realistic chance. When you
So
use that
true.
term, puncher's chance.
It's so true. But let's talk.
Yeah,
Let's talk about Michael Spinks, who had far more than a puncher's chance.
yeah.
As I said
Here
at the
goes.
top, let's have a look at that.
Michael Spinks. My book came out, an authorized biography of Michael Spinks, meaning we worked on it together. And I had to push Michael a lot because Michael talks a little less now than he did the past year. Michael Spinks is a quiet, modest guy. You got to sit next to him during, an awards banquet there in New York. Did he say anything to you the whole time?
The occasional thing, but it was very brief. It was difficult to initiate a conversation to the point that
Exactly.
I did try on a couple of occasions, but I sensed I just sensed he didn't particularly want to engage.
No,
But
that's
he
not
was
it.
but he wasn't rude. He wasn't rude or anything like that. But I just sensed that I was, because I grew like when I fell in love with boxing. Michael Spinks was making that historic move from light heavyweight to heavyweight. Larry Holmes is hoping to finish the end of his career unbeaten, beat Rocky Marciano's record. You don't think, even though we know Michael Spinks was a great light heavyweight, it'd never been done in history that anybody had gone up from light heavyweight to heavyweight to win. So yeah, I mean, to be sat next to him, and I think that was 2016 or 2017. It was the day.
2017.
It was the day after the Lomachenko
Yeah,
Rigondo fight, wasn't it?
yeah.
Yeah, and Spinks was sat next to me at the top
Yeah, but
table.
Michael Spinks, for this book, it's an authorized biography, and I had to keep pushing Michael, push him to talk. Certain things he didn't want to talk about. He kind of really wanted to duck the issue. But when I first decided to do the book and how I decided to do it on Michael Spinks, it happened by chance. I'd never written a book before, and it kind of was bothering me. But who was I going to write it on? And I'm talking to my friend Don Majeski, international boxing agent.
Of
And Don
course, of course.
Majeski had worked for Butch Lewis for 7 years at Butch Lewis Productions, Spinks' promoter. And then it hits me like a ton of bricks. I said, Don, if I write a book on Michael Spinks, would you have a lot of stories to tell me about the years working for Butch Lewis and about Michael Spinks? And he said he would. And I decided I'm going to write the book on Michael Spinks. I didn't think Michael Spinks was going to get involved. I didn't know Michael Spinks well, but I knew his representative, Flo Anthony, who's now his wife, ironically. Towards the end, when just before the book had to be published, they got married, so I had to slip that in there quick. And I said, look, Flo, I'm going to be writing the book on Michael, whether I have his cooperation or not. But if it's an authorized biography, it'll be much better because a book had never been written on Michael Spinks alone. There was another book written on both Leon and Michael. But any book written on Leon and Michael is going to slightly focus on Leon a little more. And I'm not saying that other book did, but people are going to focus on Leon more because he's a more charismatic guy, the personality, whatever. And she says, Flo Anthony said, let me check with Michael whether he want to cooperate and, go into it with you. And she calls me back within an hour and puts Michael on the phone, and it was a go. Authorized biography, but I hadn't met Michael before. And as I put down in the book, we arranged the three of us with Flo, Michael, myself to meet at a restaurant. And when we met there, I kind of came prepared because I was friendly with Charles Mooney, his 1976 Olympic teammate. So as soon as we sat down, I say to Michael, a friend of mine wants to say hello to you. And there he's looking at Flo like, what am I, a fan or whatever? He doesn't even know me. And he's putting his friend on. But I put Charles Mooney on, and that broke the ice, and that was good. But Michael, you had to push. And what's ironic, Butch Lewis, who really could have devastated Michael financially, and he lost a lot of money at the end, his relationship with Butch Lewis, because Butch Lewis was in control of all of Michael's finances, and Michael allowed that to be. Not only when he fought, after he retired, Butch paid all his bills. He put his whole life in Butch's hands. And then Butch dies, and Michael is destitute. Destitute.
Is
And has
he?
to recover. No, not now, thankfully. He
Right,
had
right.
to recover and get some of his money back. So the amount of Michael doesn't nearly have the amount of money he should, but the amount of money he has puts him in a category above middle class. He'll be
Hmm,
fine. As
hmm.
long as he doesn't throw money away, he can live off the interest his rest of his life. He can't live extravagantly, but he can be comfortable the rest of his life. And, hopefully that's the case. But when I'm asking about Butch Lewis, at one point, Michael's getting very upset. And I said to him, "Are you scared? This book's gonna make Butch look bad." And he nods his head. He didn't want Butch Lewis still to look bad. And he even told me during the book, after we'd known one another very well, and I asked if Butch came back to life and said, "Let's get rid of this guy, Slim," his nickname for Michael, meaning get rid of me. Would you get rid of me if Butch said so? And he nodded his head. You know? And this is with Michael and myself having a good relationship.
Yes, yes, yes. But there's some great stuff from Michael in there. I mean, I haven't read it in full yet, but I mean, the kind of way you're describing Michael, and even if you go back and if you look at old broadcasts from when he was fighting, he was very humble, and the humility comes across on the pages of your book. In that boxers are kind of by design they have to be cocksure, they have to believe they're invincible. But there's certain things there with Michael when he's talking about, say, his heavyweight adventure, whether it was Larry Holmes or Jerry Cooney or even Mike Tyson. There was always this awareness that, well, I think I'm going to win, but I might not. These guys are massive; they hit really hard. And I thought a really interesting passage was when he's talking about that ring walk and then when he's waiting for Mike Tyson, because it's all been a bit muddied over time in that people now say that Michael Spinks was scared to death before the opening bell even sounded against Mike Tyson. And I thought he explained all of that really, really well.
Yeah, even Wally Matthews, who was a reporter, at the time in New York, was telling me he was at ringside right before Michael Spinks got in the ring to fight Mike Tyson, and he heard Michael Spinks say, "I'll do the best I can," as opposed to other fighters who are getting psyched. But that's his attitude. That's his attitude now. Whenever they asked Bob Foster when he was alive how he'd do against Michael Spinks, Foster would get angry, say, "Oh, I would knock him out. I'd do this. I'd do that." And if you told Bob Foster, "Nah, Michael Spinks is much better than you," he would get angry. If you said that to Michael Spinks, I think Bob Foster would have knocked you out. I think it was a better light heavyweight than you. He'd say, "You're entitled to your opinion." It wouldn't bother him, and you could sit down and share a meal with him,
Yeah.
and he wouldn't be annoyed about it at all. He's kind of like laid back and everything. You know, a couple of fighters that struck me their responses talking for this book. One was a fighter who people aren't going to remember, who Michael knocked out in 3 rounds in defense of the light heavyweight title, David Sears. He
I remember
talked to me
David
for the
Sears.
book, but he didn't want to talk to me. But he was a gentleman. It was like a professional. I was reminding him of when his dream evaporated, kind of, but he sucked it up. He talked to me. He was being a real pro. And then it was Jerry Cooney. Was he animated? Cooney couldn't stop talking about it. I would have broken him in half. Do you have the guts to print it? And then Jerry, who I love, he's a big teddy bear. Jerry wanted to see what I wrote. And I go, "Jerry, I'm not sending you what I wrote for your approval. Forget about it. You just tell me, what do you want me to put in from your viewpoint?" And he told me, "You put down that I would have broken Michael Spinks in half on my best day. He wasn't in my class." And Cooney lost 3 fights in his career. The Holmes fight, is one. I mean, he's learned to live with it to a degree. The Foreman fight, he's kind of learned to live with it. The Spinks loss still bothers him. He doesn't dislike Michael personally. They see one another a lot at these banquets. And he says, "No, Michael's all right." He says, I like Michael, but it's strictly professionally." And then you ask Michael how he would have done against Cooney, and he says, I think my style matched up well against his. And he says, maybe Jerry's right. Maybe Jerry would have knocked me out of my best day. I don't think so. I doubt if he would have, but, he may have. He doesn't like dismiss Cooney's notion. And then he says he wishes Cooney would kind of get over it. It's done. It's over with. Who knows what would have happened? And I had Cooney also on my podcast, and I gave him an awkward question. Cooney said he wasn't the same fighter. He was a sick kid, this and that. He had substance abuse problem when he fought Michael Spinks. So I said, okay, Jerry, if you don't want to give Michael credit for beating that version of you, should we give you credit for beating Ken Norton, Jimmy Young, and Ron Lyle at that stage of their career? And
did you say that? Did you say that?
I did say it. I know Jerry well now. I like him a great deal, but sometimes you have to call people out on things. I mean, I think it bothers Jerry tremendously that he's going through life and he can't be called a former heavyweight champion. And he's kind of, placing the blame elsewhere, and not quite taking full accountability. He says, well, why didn't I get a rematch with Holmes immediately? Or why wasn't I allowed to fight Mike Weaver for the WBA heavyweight title? Instead, I write down about that in the book, why, with Weaver, according to what the late Mike Jones's co-manager told me all the way back in 1989.
It's still a heck of a win for Michael Spinks over Jerry Cooney back then, and I think it kind of solidifies Spinks's heavyweight credentials at the time while you were living through it. And you've got Larry Holmes, 40. Was he 48-0 before the first fight?
48-0. Yeah.
What was your opinion on Michael Spinks's chances as he was stepping up to the heavyweight division? Did you think he had a chance against Larry Holmes?
I wasn't the biggest Michael Spinks fan, quite honestly. I respected him, and I recognized he was a great fighter. But you would think that Holmes, was a little too big and so on. It's too big a leap, and we know light heavyweight history. No light heavyweight champion had ever won the heavyweight title before. So, I mean, I can't specifically recall what I was thinking, but had I picked Spinks to win, I would remember that now. I gave Leon Spinks a legitimate chance of shocking Muhammad Ali. That I remember, as crazy as it is, because I knew Ali wasn't going to be in shape, and Leon was going to throw punches nonstop the whole fight. So I wasn't as dismissive of that, but I probably was dismissive of Michael Spinks' chances because I have no recollection of thinking he'd have a good chance. But when I was writing the book, the reality set in when Michael would tell me stories of all the quality heavyweights he sparred with on a regular basis in Joe Frazier's gym, and I talked to them like Pinklin Thomas, James Bone Crusher Smith. He sparred Tim Witherspoon, Marvis Frazier, Randall Tex Cobb. These are big guys, and he sparred with them on a regular basis. And by the time he fought Larry Holmes, he wasn't fighting a guy who was so massively big in his mind. He was fighting a guy who was good. He recognized how good Holmes was. And even Michael says when the fight got made, he wasn't sure whether he could win or not. That's how, and he asked Butch Lewis, and Butch Lewis said, yeah, you can beat him, Slim. And then Michael thought, okay, let's try. The years he was at Joe Frazier's gym, I think my favorite story in the book is when Michael's telling me about him and Joe Frazier. Now, Joe Frazier and Butch Lewis were extremely close friends. And according to Michael, they were inseparable. That's how close they were. So Michael goes up to Joe Frazier's office at Joe Frazier's gym, and he's joking around with him, teasing him. And, Michael loved Joe, but Joe got a little annoyed as much as he liked Michael. And the next thing you know, they're in the ring. And Michael was the world light heavyweight champion at the time, and Joe Frazier's retired and out of shape, and Michael is doubling over laughing that they're going to spar. And then the bell rings, and Michael's in a giddy mood, and Joe's coming out smoking and tells me, throwing these mean left hooks, and he says, all of a sudden I'm realizing Joe could take my head off. And he says, I'm running all over the ring just to survive. And he's coming after me. And he told me afterwards, good thing Joe wasn't in shape. Good thing for me. I,
How does Michael now reflect on his achievements? I've always thought it must, and he talks about it. He talks about it. You talk about it. You describe it. And I must say, some of the stuff that you do, where you do go completely behind the scenes, you've obviously spoke to a lot of people. This isn't just like you. This isn't you just regurgitating well-known stories. You've done an awful lot. But how does Michael reflect on his career? Because I always thought that to walk away after a one-round loss in his biggest fight,
he knew he was going to retire. And credit to Butch Lewis. Butch Lewis wouldn't allow him to come back, and Michael didn't ask to come back. It entered his mind, but he knew he was basically retired. What Michael missed most wasn't, the glory. It was his job boxing. I know he had a job a little while in maintenance that didn't work out when he was young, coming back from the Olympics, and he delivered newspapers when he was a teenager for a little while. But that was his job, his only job. Being a boxer, he enjoyed going to the gym, and that's how he kind of like put in his hours. But Michael always had a philosophy that was different from any other fighter. When he was winning all those fights, he had made up his mind that he was going to continue fighting until he lost the fight. Any other fighter is going to say they want to retire unbeaten. They never plan to lose a fight. And Michael thought, when I lose a fight, I'm going to retire. But he knew the way he lost against Tyson and how hard it was to make the fight. He wasn't going to get a rematch with Tyson. If this was a different situation, like Floyd Patterson against Sonny Liston, Floyd Patterson was the one and only champion. So when he lost to Liston, he was going to get a rematch. It's kind of like an obligation. You give a champion his rematch. He knew it was going to happen. He'd have to get back online. Flo Anthony told me, well, she wished he'd gone back down to cruiserweight, won a title there, beat Carlos de Leon, and then retire as a champion. So people wouldn't remember him getting knocked out by Tyson. But that was a defining moment of Tyson's career. And I think people give Michael Spinks a pass on that. But the thing about it, when you talk about Michael Spinks, and this is with other fighters as well, and this is fascinating, Matt, they dismiss his career as a heavyweight like it never took place in a certain sense. They talk about the Holmes and Cooney fights, but he had 5 fights as a heavyweight. They don't talk about Michael Spinks as a pound-for-pound great. They talked about him as a light heavyweight great. Now there's so many divisions, we don't know where to put certain fighters in what division. Like, take one of our modern greats from not long ago, Roy Jones. We talk about him as a pound-for-pound great. We don't know what division to put him in. We put him in one division if we have to. Is it middleweight? Is it super middleweight? Is it light heavyweight? We don't know. So, and other fighters like Joe Calzaghe, Andre Ward, we know to place them basically as super middleweights. But so with Michael, they don't think of him pound for pound. Another thing I just want to quickly mention with the book, certain people I didn't talk to. Michael requested a handful of people I maybe not talked to in his personal life. And because it's his biography, I had to respect his boundaries. But I also told Michael, this isn't going to be a fan book. And it wasn't. I point out things in Michael's personal life that don't reflect well on him. And he knew beforehand when we were getting into it, that was going to be the case. There were going to be some little warts. But the one thing that happened to me that was so funny, Michael's married now to Flo Anthony, but I had to have him talk about the times he was unfaithful to her. And Flo is there, and it's in her small New York apartment. And the stuff was going to get in the book anyway, and Michael was so uncomfortable. She's behind him, and she's saying, yeah, I want to hear all this. And he is so nervous. His face, the whole time, he has a stone face. He's bobbing and weaving, avoiding every question best he can. But at the end of our 3 hour session, so when he walked me to the door, it's just me and him. He looks at me, smiles, and goes like this, like you know the way it is, Jack, with us guys. He gave me one of those looks, and that had me laughing, at the end.
Yeah. So is he in a good place these days, Michael?
Good question. Good question. About 3 weeks ago, myself and Don Majeski visited Michael, and we went out, walked the streets of Manhattan, and Don was looking at this, and I wasn't really looking at it carefully. Don said he noticed some people looking in our direction at Michael as if they know him from somewhere. He had on the big hat, but he's still recognizable. He walks slower. He looks good, like a good physical presence, but he does forget some things. He didn't. His memory was good when we were talking on the book, interviewing, but that was like, oh man, that was like a year or so ago. The book has come out, since when we were doing all these extensive interviews. And I've talked to him since. He doesn't engage in phone conversations. It's ridiculous. You could call him, calling him on the phone is futile. He doesn't pick up and he doesn't say anything. And you got to push him to talk, like for the book, like a trainer pushes a fighter. But he'd been going to the Cleveland Clinic for years to be tested for dementia. They have a program for boxers. And from everything I was told, he didn't have it and so on. Is he forgetful? Yeah, I mean, look, let's face the reality of it. Look at all the big name fighters. I mean, how many of them go through life completely clear minded? I mean, Michael remembers the stories of the past. He'll talk about them and so on. And fighters react differently. I just can't say for sure. But right now, he would be a terrible interview. I'll be honest about it. If I thought Michael was going to be a great interview, I would have had him on with myself. I would have said, Matt, how about Michael? And I could have gotten him to come on. But Michael isn't going to say much. To get him to talk, you have to be with him in private. He has to know you well, and you have to push him, and you have to be close enough with him, like I became to the point. Come on, darn it, Michael, talk. Give me some more. Tell me a couple of sentences. Speak out. And then finally, it cranked him up, and I could get him going for a few sentences on his career. But even for the book, there'd be some things I'd say. I'd say, look, can I write this or that? Could these be your words? Is this what you want me to say? And sometimes he'd say, no, I don't want you to say that. So I wouldn't say that. And that other times he'd say, that's exactly what I want you to say. And I write about that in the book for the sake of full transparency. Not every single word quotable is attributed, to him exactly in that sense. But that's exactly what he once said.
Well, you should be really proud of yourself, Jack, because without you, a lot of the thoughts that he's got in his head, a lot of the memories, they wouldn't be out there, and we would never get to hear them. But because of your book, they're out there, and they're on A Great Fighter. Just as we wrap up, where can people get your book? Remind everybody again.
Well, go. Thanks, Matt. Go to the websites, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Walmart. Okay, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, or Walmart. Those websites are going to have the book, on sale there. I mean, that's the best way of getting it.
And it's Michael the Jinx Spinks,
Michael
the
Jinx
authorized
Spinks.
biographer.
I didn't know what title to give it. I was going to have a contest, but months went by before the book came out, and I thought, let's make it simple. Michael Jinx Spinks. An authorized biography, and make it simple. So many times you get caught up in fancy names of the book, and what was I going to put down? Oh, history making champion. Those names are so common, to the point, Michael Jinx Spinks. And I had a lot of fun writing it. I couldn't talk to everyone too, Matt, because of a moment ago where we were talking about certain of his old opponents had dementia or some reason. And I was trying to track down Dwight Muhammad Qawi before I died. and I didn't know for sure he had dementia. It came out after he died, and there were various reasons, but I got in touch with as many people as I logically could have and chased after certain people. One thing I regret, though, when I finally got to talk to Larry Holmes had been told to be very nice to me. That's exactly what I didn't want. I wanted Larry to vent about Michael and not badmouth him, but give me his real feelings. Larry Holmes is too much of a gentleman. And I heard from other people, Larry's let go. He's not bitter about their fights anymore. So maybe that's how he was really, feeling. But he came across, look, it's in the past, whatever. But Larry also he rationalized. He said, well, it's not Michael's fault that the judges did what they did. I can't hold it against Michael. And Michael on his end says, I think Larry knows I beat him inside. But I just write on the book, you can invite Larry Holmes and Michael Spinks to dinner. They'll gladly break bread together. You could sit them at the same table. Just don't put them right next to one another. Let one person be the side, and they'll get along really great. They'll get along great if you give them their space.
That's brilliant, Jack. We've done an hour, and I could do several more.
Yeah,
and maybe we'll get you on again to go through some more.
Oh, I loved it, Matt. I loved it.
Some more of your memories. They're wonderful to hear, and thank you so much for sharing.
And I appreciate all the years when you were the editor of Boxing News, and I wrote there all the kind words and the support. You have a great quality of making people feel good about themselves. I wish I could be better in that quality. I just don't think of it, as really, much. But yeah,
I really, really appreciate that, Jack. Thanks again for coming on. And we will be back with another opening bell very, very soon.
Okay, all the best.
That's done. If you just no.